Okay, so are you ready to dive into this?
Oh, absolutely I am.
Yeah.
It's a wild one, that's for sure.
It is the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state.
Yeah.
It sounds like, I don't know, something out of a movie,
Right.
but it's gotten people talking
It really has.
and worried too, especially in Canada. We've got a
Yeah.
really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive. We've got a
Okay.
Canadian subreddit that we're looking at, and then we've got a UK newspaper article, kind of a more formal take.
Okay.
And we're trying to figure out, is this a real threat? Is it a political ploy?
Yeah.
Is it just like trolling? What's going on here?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I think, it
Yeah.
really speaks to the state of U.S.-Canada relations right now.
Yeah, I think so too. So where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, I guess we got to start with Trump, right? He said he might consider using quote unquote economic force to bring Canada into the U.S.
That's right, yeah. The UK article actually quotes him directly. He said, no, economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
That would really be I mean, is he serious? Like legally, can he even do that?
From a legal perspective, it's a complete fantasy.
Mhm.
There's absolutely no precedent in international law for a country to absorb another one through
No.
economic pressure.
Okay.
So, the whole idea of economic force is so vague,
Mhm.
it's almost meaningless.
Hmm.
It really holds no legal water whatsoever.
Okay, so legally, it's a non-starter. But I mean, could the U.S., like practically, could they just sort of pull Canada in like that?
I mean, logistically, it's even more absurd. Canada is a huge country. It's
Yeah.
diverse. It's got a strong national identity.
Right.
Even if the U.S. could somehow, cripple Canada's economy, which is a huge if,
Yeah.
you're not going to erase Canadian culture and patriotism. I mean,
Right.
it's just not how nations work.
And speaking of that Canadian patriotism, you should see this Reddit thread. It's nuts. People are outraged. They don't believe it. Some are joking about it.
Yeah.
But nobody's taking this lightly.
Yeah, I think it's understandable. Trump's rhetoric has this dangerous echo of things we've seen recently that have kind of shaken the foundation of
Yeah.
international norms,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's hard not to draw parallels with Putin's justification for the invasion of Ukraine.
Right, exactly. And unsurprisingly, pretty much every major Canadian political leader has rejected this whole annexation thing,
Yeah.
from Trudeau to the conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
Right. And their responses are really interesting, actually. I mean, Trudeau, for example, he didn't hold back at all. He said, and I quote, "There isn't a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would become part of the United States."
Wow.
Right. So it's not even just a rejection. He's kind of making a point of highlighting the strong relationship
Oh,
between the
it's-
countries, emphasizing the security partnership.
Yeah.
It's very strategic, I think.
So Trudeau's doubling down on that partnership. But Poilievre, while he rejects the idea of annexation, he seems to be going in a different direction. He's talking about bolstering Canada's military, tightening up the border, focusing on resource development. Sounds kind of like a Canada First stance almost?
Yeah, you're right. That's a really good observation. It's very similar to the language that Trump uses.
Yeah.
But he's rejecting the proposal outright.
Yeah.
So is it genuine? Is he trying to deter the U.S. or is he kind of playing the same game,
Right.
but on the Canadian side?
Yeah. And that's where this Reddit thread gets really interesting. There are a lot of people in that thread who are suspicious of Poilievre's motives. They see him aligning with Trump's ideology. They're worried about U.S. influence. There's even one user who called him, and I quote, a Canadian Trump.
It's important to remember that these are just opinions and perceptions.
Yeah.
But when you look at Poilievre's past, his support for the Freedom Convoy, which itself had pretty strong ties to right-wing American groups, it does lend some weight to those concerns.
Yeah, for sure. And that quick pivot to Canada first after Trump's statement, it's definitely eyebrow-raising.
Definitely. Politically, it's a savvy move.
Yeah.
But it also feeds into this underlying anxiety about a potential erosion of Canadian sovereignty.
So, I'm curious, has the U.S. ever seriously considered annexing Canada before? Historically, has this ever been a thing?
There have been a few times, mostly in the 19th century, where the idea kind of popped up in American politics.
Okay.
But it never went anywhere. It was never like a real policy proposal, never had widespread support.
So it's not like this is a recurring theme
Right.
in U.S.-Canada relations. What's different this time? Why are we even talking about this now?
Well, this is where the global context is really important. The geopolitical landscape has changed a lot in recent years, right? We've got the rise of nationalism, populism all over the world. Traditional alliances are being questioned. There's increasing competition for resources. It's a much more volatile and unpredictable world.
So this annexation talk, while it sounds crazy on the surface, is
Yeah.
really kind of a symptom of something much deeper.
Exactly. And it's playing out in a really specific way in Canada. One of the biggest anxieties we're seeing in the Reddit thread is what people are calling the Puerto Rico scenario.
The Puerto Rico scenario.
Yeah.
Oh, right. The fear that Canada would become like a second-class territory, just like Puerto Rico, without full rights, no representation. Pretty grim.
It is.
Yeah.
And I understand why people are drawing that parallel. I mean, they point to the fact that Puerto Ricans, even though they're U.S. citizens,
Right.
they can't vote in presidential elections.
Yeah.
They don't have full representation in Congress.
Right.
So is that fear legitimate? I mean, is the Puerto Rico scenario a real possibility?
Yeah. I mean, could that happen?
I think this fear, while it's understandable, comes from a misunderstanding of how the U.S. political system actually works. Puerto Rico's status is very unique.
Okay.
And it's complicated, you know?
Yeah.
It's rooted in its history as a colony. Canada's completely different. It's huge. It's got a large population. It's got its own political structures.
Right.
It's just highly unlikely that it would be integrated in the same way.
Okay, so you're saying the Puerto Rico comparison, while it makes sense emotionally, it's not really accurate here.
Exactly. It's
Yes.
apples and oranges. A more likely scenario, if we're even going to entertain this hypothetical,
Yeah.
is that Canada would be divided up into multiple states,
Okay.
each with full representation in Congress.
So instead of one big territory, Canada would be carved up into
Right.
individual states.
Exactly. But think about what that would mean for a second. It would completely change the balance of power in the U.S. political system.
Right. I hadn't even thought of that.
I mean, that's a seismic shift, right?
Yeah.
And that in itself is another reason why this whole annexation idea is so out there. I mean, it's just not in the U.S.'s best interest to do something
Right.
so radical.
Yeah. It would just create chaos. So it's not just about Canada saying no. It's about the nightmare it would create for the U.S.
Exactly. And we haven't even touched on, the potential social and cultural upheaval that would cause on
Right.
both sides of the border.
So it's a fun thought experiment, but it doesn't seem likely at all.
Yeah, but you know what? Even improbable events, they can spark important conversations
Right.
and force us to kind of confront these uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, that's a good point. So even though Canada becoming the 51st state is really unlikely,
Right.
Trump's rhetoric has definitely, stirred the pot, so to speak.
It's exposed some nerves, and it's forced us to look at the Canada-U.S. relationship in a new light.
All right, so we've said that annexation is pretty much off the table, but what are the effects of all this? How has this whole thing affected the relationship between Canada and the U.S.?
That's a great question, and it's one that we're going to explore further as we continue our deep dive. But before we do that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think it's fascinating how much this has exposed these anxieties within Canada about its place in the world, especially in relation to the U.S.
Yeah, you've hit on something really important there. This whole thing has raised these fundamental questions about Canadian identity, about sovereignty, about the future of the relationship in this crazy world we're living in.
Yeah, those are big questions.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to be with us for a while, but we'll unpack them
Yeah.
in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, stay with us.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about this annexation idea, the politics, the history, even the legality of it all.
Right.
But I think it's time we think about what this means for, regular Canadians.
Absolutely. I think we've, talked about the political side of things, but it's important to look at the potential impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
And, if you look at that Reddit thread, there's a lot of anxiety about exactly that.
So besides the politics, how could this actually affect people? What are we talking about here?
Well, I think the most immediate impact would be economic.
Okay.
As we've said, Canada's economy is very tied to the U.S., and any disruption to that, even the threat of a disruption, could really shake things up.
So we're talking job losses, businesses closing, maybe even prices going up on everyday stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about concrete measures like tariffs or trade barriers.
Right.
Just the uncertainty itself can really hurt investment and economic activity.
Makes sense. I mean, businesses need to know what to expect, and this throws a wrench in everything.
Exactly. And that uncertainty can also affect the currency markets, which could impact the value of the Canadian dollar.
Okay.
A weaker Canadian dollar means imports get more expensive, which can lead to inflation and ultimately hit consumers' wallets.
So the average Canadian could really feel it in their daily life.
Exactly. It's not just some abstract political debate. It has real consequences.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just about the money either, right?
Yeah.
We have to consider the social and cultural impacts too.
Absolutely.
Right.
This isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about national identity.
It's about what it means to be Canadian.
Exactly. The idea of Canada being absorbed into the U.S. would be a huge cultural shift. It would raise questions about everything from language and education
Yeah.
to healthcare and social programs,
Yeah.
areas where Canada and the U.S. have very different approaches.
Yeah, those are big differences. And they're really important to Canadians.
They are. And it's hard to imagine how such a drastic change wouldn't lead to some serious cultural clashes.
And that's something people are talking about in the Reddit thread.
Right. People are really wrestling with what it would mean to lose their distinct Canadian identity
Yeah.
to be assimilated into American culture.
It's interesting, though. It's not all doom and gloom. There's also a lot of talk about how Canadians would respond if this actually happened.
Right.
What would they do?
And there's a whole range of ideas. Some are talking about peaceful protests, civil disobedience. Others are even mentioning armed resistance, although that seems pretty far-fetched given Canada's history.
Yeah, Canadians aren't exactly known for being revolutionaries.
Right.
But it shows how strongly they feel about their national identity.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
And it highlights a deep mistrust of American motives.
Yeah, a lot of Canadians see this as the U.S. trying to take advantage of Canada's resources.
Right.
And basically undermine its independence.
It's not hard to see why they'd feel that way. I mean, the U.S. does have a history of intervening in other countries, often to benefit itself.
Yeah, that history is definitely shaping how Canadians are reacting to all of this.
Oh, sure.
Which brings us back to Pierre Poilievre and his Canada First platform. Is this a genuine attempt to stand up to the U.S., or is it just playing into the same kind of nationalism that's causing problems all over the world?
That's the question, isn't it? It's hard to know for sure what Poilievre's real intentions are, but his message is definitely resonating with some Canadians.
Okay.
Those who feel like Canada's been getting a raw deal in its relationship with the U.S.
People who feel like Canada's been taken advantage of.
Yeah. And those who are generally suspicious of globalization and international institutions.
Okay.
They see Poilievre's Canada First approach as a way to take back control. Put Canadian interests first.
It's a powerful message, for sure.
Yeah.
But is it realistic in today's world? I mean, the world is so interconnected.
Right. And that's what Poilievre's critics are saying. They say this kind of nationalism is divisive and ultimately harmful.
Okay.
They're worried it'll alienate Canada's allies and damage its reputation on the world stage.
So where does that leave Trudeau? How is he handling all of this?
Well, he's in a tough spot. He needs to reassure Canadians that they're safe,
Right.
that their country isn't going to disappear.
Yeah.
But he also needs to keep things running smoothly with the U.S.
Because let's face it, Canada needs the U.S. and the U.S. needs Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a complicated relationship. They're deeply connected economically, militarily, culturally. A complete break would hurt both sides. So Trudeau has to find a way to stand up for Canada without destroying that relationship.
So what's the best way forward for Canada? How can it be independent but also maintain those ties with the U.S.?
That's a question that Canadians are going to be grappling with for a long time. There's no easy answer. But one thing's for sure, Canada needs a clear plan,
Okay.
a foreign policy that reflects its own values and interests.
And a plan that takes into account how the world is changing.
Exactly. Canada can't just rely on old assumptions and alliances. It needs to be flexible, strategic, and ready to go its own way if necessary.
And that includes dealing with a neighbor to the south that can be a little unpredictable.
Exactly. The next few years are going to be a real test for Canada.
So we've talked about the challenges, but are there any opportunities here? Could all of this actually lead to a stronger, more confident Canada on the world stage?
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
And I think it's possible this whole episode could be a wake-up call for Canada. A chance to rethink its priorities, strengthen its relationships with other countries, and maybe even rediscover its sense of purpose.
So it's not just about surviving. It's about using this to become stronger.
Exactly. And that's something a lot of Canadians are talking about.
So moving forward, it's not just about reacting to what's happening around them. It's about taking control of their own future.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that needs to involve everyone, politicians, experts, and everyday Canadians.
Okay, so we're back. And I guess now it's time to look ahead, try to figure out what the future holds for Canada after all of this.
Yeah, it's the big question, right? Where does Canada go from here? And we have to remember we're talking about possibilities, not predictions. The future is always changing, especially when it comes to geopolitics.
Right, no guarantees. But based on what we've talked about, what are some of the scenarios that seem, plausible? What are the different paths Canada could take?
Well, one possibility is that things basically stay the same, but with a lot more caution. Canada and the U.S. stay close allies, but there's this wariness on Canada's part, maybe a push for more economic independence.
Okay, so not a total break, but definitely a shift towards doing things their own way.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Canada still benefits from the relationship, but it's also aware of the risks that come with it.
So in this scenario, Canada is kind of hedging its bets, sticking with the U.S., but looking at other options too.
Exactly. And that leads to another possibility, a more assertive Canada on the world stage, strengthening ties with other countries, maybe in Europe or Asia, as a way to counterbalance U.S. influence.
So a Canada that's more outward-looking, less reliant on the U.S., more engaged with the rest of the world.
Exactly. It's about diversifying its relationships, building more independent foreign policy, recognizing that its interests aren't always the same as the U.S.'s, and being willing to chart its own course.
Now, I know some people are worried that if Canada tries to be more independent, the U.S. might retaliate, with economic pressure or political interference.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. It's a delicate balancing act. Canada needs to stand up for itself without completely alienating its biggest trading partner. It's about finding ways to disagree without destroying the relationship.
So how can Canada do that? How can it be independent but still work with the U.S.?
It takes diplomacy, strategic thinking, and understanding what both sides want. It's about finding common ground, but also being firm on things that really matter.
And maybe even more importantly, finding other countries that share Canada's concerns about how the U.S. is acting in the world.
Absolutely. Canada can't do this alone.
Yeah.
It needs to build strong partnerships with other countries that believe in things like multilateralism, international cooperation, a rules-based global order.
It's about building a network of support, a group of countries that can push back against what some see as an increasingly unpredictable and maybe even aggressive U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we get to a more extreme but less likely scenario. The possibility of Canada itself splitting apart, with some provinces siding more with the U.S. and others going their own way.
Well, hold on. Are we talking about Canada actually breaking up?
It's a long shot,
Okay.
but it does reflect the deep divisions that exist in Canada. The West versus the East, oil and gas versus green energy, different ideas about what Canada should be. These tensions have been there for a long time, and this whole situation could make them worse.
So maybe not a complete breakup, but these internal divisions could make it harder for Canada to act as one on the world stage.
Exactly. And that's something other countries, including the U.S., could take advantage of.
Yeah.
Playing different regions against each other and weakening Canada's position.
So it's possible that this whole thing could actually make Canada more vulnerable, not just to pressure from outside, but to problems within its own borders.
It's a real risk. And it shows how important it is for Canadians to find common ground to overcome those divisions and build a shared sense of national purpose.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember? What should they be watching for in the future?
I think the key thing is to pay attention to how Canada positions itself in the world. Look for signs that it's diversifying its relationships, both economically and politically. Watch for changes in trade patterns, new alliances, and how Canada acts on important global issues.
So basically, watch how Canada is navigating this whole geopolitical situation, how it's balancing its relationship with the U.S. with its own changing interests and goals.
Exactly. And pay attention to what's happening within Canada. How are the different regions reacting? Are they coming together or pulling apart? And what are the politicians doing? Are they putting the country first or just playing politics?
It's about understanding how all of these things, both inside and outside of Canada, are shaping the country's choices and ultimately its future.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the decisions we make today.
Well, this has been a really amazing conversation. We've gone from Trump's annexation comments to the potential reshaping of the world. It's been a wild ride.
It has. But as we always say, knowledge is power. By understanding what's going on, we can be better prepared for the challenges ahead and maybe even help create a better future.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious.
And keep exploring. We'll see you next time.